All right, I'm back. I'm just going to quickly go over the faction focus articles we've seen so far. We've seen about 9, which is probably half, just under half of what we're going to see for 10th edition. Just going to briefly go over every single one, and then I'm going to rank them at the end. I'm going to rank them in terms of interest and presentation. So, for example, how well I think they describe the faction and how they're going to play, and how interesting that playstyle is, rather than just what seems powerful. So, starting off, you have Space Marines. They kind of talk about how they've already revealed the faction ability. The faction ability is Oath of Moment. You pick a target and you reroll all hit and wound rolls against it. It's very Ultramarines because it's just the Seal of Oath from previous editions. But I think it's a reasonable rule. It's also obviously quite powerful depending on what you're playing against. Next, we have the Detachment rule. This is going to be your doctrines for the Gladius Task Force. And effectively, they're all movement related in some way. So, Devastator Doctrine, Advance and Shoot. Tactile Doctrine, Fall Back, Shoot and Charge. Assault Doctrine, Advance and Charge. I think this is a very good revision of this rule. Before, first of all, AP is just not an exciting buff. It just isn't. Just to get +1 AP on a certain kind of weapon isn't very exciting. And also, it was slightly confusing when players. I can't tell you how many times I play against Space Marines and they're like, oh, what turn are my pistols better? Or what turn are my grenades having bonus AP? This is very straightforward. The lore explanation of what Devastator Doctrine is longer than what Devastator Doctrine actually does. So I like this. Also, you're flexible with these. You can pick them in whatever order you want, it seems like. So if you can assault and charge on turn 1, go ahead and try to assault and charge on turn 1. As far as the units go, they show the Land Raider. I think the biggest thing with the Land Raider that was revealed to us is that it's very tanky. It's T12. And with the assault ramp and being able to charge after getting out of the Land Raider, after the Land Raider moves, means that the threat range of units in the Land Raider is probably very long. And also, we still don't really know how disembarking works. I don't think we know how far away from the transport you disembark, if you can move after you disembark, if you could advance after you disembark, because you could get out of the Land Raider, maybe you can't move, but for some reason you can advance. I don't know. We don't really know. Next, we have Guilliman. He's kind of the supreme leader of the faction. They have shown a few of these, and Guilliman kind of tracks with the rest. It's pretty common that they have some kind of a command phase aura, and you pick one, and then they each do something different. So, Guilliman's, he has a 6-inch aura of better objective control and battle shock and leadership buffs. Master of Battle lets him pick a second Oath of Moment target, and if you've already killed the first one, you get the same effect onto the second one. And then the third bonus is a unit within 12 can use a stratagem for free, and you can use a stratagem you've already used that phase. So I think something you'll probably see pretty commonly is you take Guilliman, you use something like Supreme Strategist immediately to buff 2 units to kill the first Oath of Moment target, and then in the mid game you're using Master of Battle to have a second Oath of Moment target, and then you kill that, and then towards the end of the game you use his Primarch or the 13th aura to just hold objectives after you've killed your opponent's like 2 sort of biggest baddest things. But that's just one example of how you could use them. They show the Onslaught Gatling Cannon, nothing really crazy. It has no AP, which is kind of a sign of the direction of the game. Big kind of just anti-infantry hose you down guns with a lot of attacks don't have AP anymore, or will very rarely have AP, which I think is a good thing. They show the Heavy Laser Destroyer, and then they show this stratagem. Interestingly, the stratagem is tied to the detachment. It's not tied to the faction, and it's basically fight on death. And it's 2 CP, and it's on any unit, so you can use it on your crazy character. You can use it on a block of Terminators. whichever you got to use. That's Space Marines. Next we have Tyranids. The Tyranid faction rule is Synapse, which is basically buffs to your Battle Shock tests if you're in Synapse range. This used to be Fearless. I think that the idea of Fearless just isn't in line with what they want for 10th edition, where every army kind of has to deal with Battle Shock in some way. And even then, 3d6 is like actually a substantial defense against Battle Shock, even if your leadership values aren't super high. 3d6, I haven't looked at the math, but I feel like that would actually make a huge difference as to whether or not you're going to pass those tests. And then the other army rule, so I guess they have two, is Shadow in the Warp, which is once a battle, you can just Battle Shock the entire enemy army. I don't particularly love this, so one reason I don't love it is it's just a once a game effect. So if you use this very early, then one of your army rules just does nothing for the rest of the game. Another reason I don't love it is that depending on what you're playing against, this rule could take a very long time to resolve and could also be very difficult to track. So if you Shadow in the Warp early against something like an MSU army, that's a lot of rolling, and it's a lot of tracking what's Battle Shocked and what's not. So I think it's fine as like an idea that the Tyranids are like, flooding into your world, and they're causing chaos and no one really knows what's going on, and so they're Battle Shocked, but I'm not necessarily a huge fan of this one. They also don't show the detachment, which is interesting. Next we have Gene Stealers. They don't forward deploy. I believe they have a scout move, so it says Scouts 8. It's a core ability. And they show the Swarm Lord, who gives you extra CP, and he makes your opponent's stratagems cost one more. So it's like Agents of Vect. So they use a stratagem. You say for the rest of the game that stratagem is going to cost an extra CP, and then he has a bigger Synapse range effectively. They show the Rupture Cannon. This again is kind of a weird reveal because we just saw the Heavy Laser Destroyer, and this is just like so much worse than the Heavy Laser Destroyer. It has more strength, but it has 2d6 damage, which is just like, you just don't want 2d6 damage. It's just so random. And you also have to keep in mind that the Space Marine player has Oaths of Moment, potentially Oaths of Moment twice. And so the prime target of this thing is just your opponent's biggest unit. So its hit roll and its wound roll are going to be re-rolled, whereas this probably won't. So I'm not huge on the Tyrannifex's gun. Endless Swarm is their stratagem they show off. You bring back D3 plus 3 units to 2 units, or D3 plus 3 models, excuse me, to 2 of these Endless Multitude units that I'm assuming is just hordes like Gaunt's. They say Termagants, Hormagaunts, and Gargoyles, and Neurogons. So it's fine. I could, depending on how you score objectives, this could be good because it's in your command phase, so you could bring back models, then you could score. Yeah, that's it for Tyranids. Next we have Chaos Space Marines. Their army rule is the Dark Pact, which you either pick lethal hits or sustained hits. So you either pick 6 to hit auto wound or 6 to hit explode. But if you do that, you have to take a leadership test. If you fail a leadership test, you take D3 mortal wounds. I like this army rule. I think that it's thematic, as you're channeling the power of chaos, but it has its consequences, and also the fact that it's a choice. So depending on your target, you could pick the beneficial one. I think is quite good. They show Chaos Space Marines. They re-roll wound rolls of 1 all the time, and if the enemy unit is on an objective, they have full wound re-rolls. This is a really good rule for a battle line unit. And they also have the Chaos Icon to reroll leadership tests for the Dark Pact. So there's some pretty nutty stuff you can do. I imagine just a Chaos Space Marine unit full of guys with chain swords. You take sustained hits, so everything's exploding on 6s, and then you're re-rolling all your wounds. And chain swords still have AP. They still have a point of AP. And they have 4 attacks base. So, yeah, this unit's putting out... If you just equip them all very normally with chainswords, you have 40 attacks, exploding hits, so you're probably hitting just under 40 times, and then you're rerolling all your wounds with a sprinkle of AP. Seems pretty good for just like a sort of a backline defensive objective holding unit. Next we have Abaddon. He effectively wants to always Dark Pact because he gives you CP if he passes the leadership test, and he has 5 at leadership, so he's probably going to pass it every time. And he has an aura of rerolling hits. He has an invuln save aura like Azrael, which is pretty awesome. And he has a aura of rerolling leadership and battle shock tests. So this makes perfect sense to me. He's the supreme leader of chaos basically, and his rules directly synergize with the army-wide rule. Next we see the Baleflamer, D6 plus 3 attacks, which is quite nice, reasonably random, but also has minimum 4, which doesn't feel completely horrible when you roll that 1. And it automatically hits with a sprinkle of AP and 2 damage. So I think it's a pretty good weapon. They show obliterators, which I haven't seen obliterators like on the table basically ever, but these weapons seem fine. They seem pretty similar to what already exists, and they're still quite random, but who knows? Maybe they'll be all right. And then there's strat Dark Obscuration, which effectively you're stealthed, which is going to be a keyword. I'm assuming it's either -1 to hit at range or something similar. And then if the unit is Nurgle, you have to be within 12 to be attacked. Maybe you can only be targeted within 18, and then if it's Nurgle, you can only be targeted within 12. I don't think we've seen what stealth does yet. And that's it for Chaos Space Marines. Next we have Necrons. They reanimate. It's in your command phase now. You just bring back D3 wounds, and if your unit had 1 wound models, you bring back D3 models. Effectively is how it works. Interestingly enough, you can reanimate sort of not healthy units. So you could have a unit of Scorpex. They're all wounded, but a model is dead. You roll 1 on a D3. You just bring back a Scorpex with 1 wound left, which is much more consistent than what we currently have. It's important to know this isn't Rites of Reanimation. This is reanimation protocol, so we don't know how Technomancers and Resorbs really interacts with this. It could just make it immediately happen again in like the movement phase or something. We don't really know. And then command protocols, which is the detachment rule, is if a character is in a unit, that unit has +1 to hit. The issue with this is if we keep scrolling, they don't show any characters, so we don't really know if if like a Cryptek's like 50 points, and then you can just kind of throw them in every single unit and get +1 to hit, and then that Cryptek maybe has some kind of inherent bonus that the unit gets and performs better. But alas, we see the Monolith. It's huge. It's toughness 14, has 1 million wounds. It brings units into the battlefield from other places on the battlefield or reserve, so that's pretty cool. I think that's a much better version of the rule. And then it's got a bunch of guns. I'm not really going to go over the guns. Necron Warriors, for reanimation protocols, they get D6 back, and if they're on objective, it's D3 plus 3. That's pretty great. Again, if Rites of Reanimation just is reanimation protocols sort of out of sequence, Warriors are going to be like hilariously difficult to get rid of. They've been changed to BS4 and Weapon Skill 4, which obviously is just a straight downgrade. But again, I think they assume you're just going to add a Technomancer to this unit, and then their stats are basically back to what they were before. Next, the Doomsday Cannon. Flat damage 4, D6 plus 1 shots. So its shots are very random, but everything else is not. The strength is a consistent 15, which is a great number. You're basically wounding everything on 3s. AP 4, which is like extremely high in this edition, and damage flat 4, which is great. And if it stands still, it has devastating wounds. So its wounds become mortal wounds. I like this. I think this is a good revision of the Doomsday Arc. And next we have the Void Dragon, which has a melee attack that if it attacks a vehicle is just going to absolutely annihilate it because it's going to wound on 2s. It's going to push it probably to a 5-up or 6-up save, assuming it doesn't have an invuln save. And then every converted wound does d6 plus 2 damage with 5 attacks. So this guy still just mucks vehicles. His sweep attack is alright against things like infantry. AP1 hurts a bit, but again, you're probably just using it against if you, for some reason, get tied up in combat with something that isn't a vehicle. And then their stratagem is +1 strength in melee. If you have a character in the unit, +1 AP as well. Pretty good. It's like, I was going to say it's like the Hungry Void, but that is literally what it's called. So it's now stratagem. All right. Imperial Guard, Army Rule, orders. They show all the orders. The important thing to note here is in the current edition, orders are like absurd. They somehow spread across the whole army. When I play against Imperial Guard, I just assume when my opponent says, "Oh, I'm using first rank fire, second rank fire," the whole army just has that ability. So I'm curious to see how that's going to work in this edition, because who knows if there's some character officer whose orders explode or whatever. But regardless, the orders are pretty familiar stuff here. +1 to hit, +1 hit melee, extra move, all that kind of stuff. They show Guardsmen, again, pretty in line with current Guardsmen. Some weird sort of change here is that you're literally taking like 2 boxes of Guardsmen. So if you take 20, you have 2 sergeants in the unit instead of 1. And they have sticky objectives. I don't know why this isn't just a rule, because we're going to see this again later. It's literally the exact same rule, just not called shock troops, and it's on a different unit, so I don't really love that. The Baneblade, it's a T13, so less toughness than a Monolith, but it has a lot of guns. It has a lot of guns, and it does a lot of damage, which is cool. The Battle Cannon, probably the biggest thing everyone is talking about is that it's AP1, which is pretty not great against vehicles. I don't really know what the ideal target for a battle cannon is. It's probably just elite infantry, because you're going to be wounding them on 2s if they're T5 or less. And then the 1 AP might not matter too much. If their save is like a 3 or a 4, it's kind of just okay. And then if they fail save, they die. So that seems like the ideal target for a battle cannon, especially because most like bigger vehicles in the game are going to be wounded on 5s. So this is sort of like the new purpose of the battle cannon. It's probably elite infantry or very light vehicles like a Rhino. The Volcano Cannon, you blammo something your opponent has. Its strength, it's going to wound most vehicles on 2s, and it's damage 12. So if they fail save, they just immediately die. So all right. And then the stratagem is you bring a unit back that died. Pretty. I think this is used to call like send in the next wave or something like that. All right, demons. Their army rule. It's the Shadow of Chaos. Basically, it has to do with objective control. So your deployment zone is always in the Shadow of Chaos. If you control a lot of objectives in No Man's Lane, the No Man's Lane is now the Shadow of Chaos. And if you control a lot of objectives in your opponent's deployment zone is the Shadow of Chaos. In the Shadow of Chaos, your Battle Shock tests are buffed, and if you pass them, you regen models. When your opponent does Battle Shock tests in the Shadow of Chaos, they have -1, and if they fail, they take mortal wounds. So it's the nice part about this rule is that what is the Shadow of Chaos is very clear and it's obvious, and the buff/debuff in the Shadow of Chaos is basically like the same thing, just inverted. So it's also easy to remember. I have +1, and I regain D3. You have -1, you lose D3. Makes perfect sense. And then the detachment rule is Warp Rifts, which basically, if you're deep striking into the Shadow of Chaos, you can deploy within 6 inches instead of 9. Again, this is a good rule. It's pretty powerful, and it makes sense because as the demons sort of start to control, say, the world they're on or whatever, the power of chaos increases, and they're more widespread. They're coming in from all angles. I like this rule quite a bit. I show off demonic packs, which is basically just how you use demons and non-demons monofaction armies. So in armies like Death Guard, and Thousand Suns. I think the most interesting takeaway from this is that it's very clearly like World Eaters are Khorne, Thousand Suns are Tzeentch, Death Guard are Nurgle, and then if your Warlord is Lucius the Eternal, you can get Slaanesh, which I think is pretty. To me, it's a soft confirmation that some kind of Slaanesh Codex is coming in the future. I would personally like it if World Eaters just becomes a Khorne book and you can take Khorne Demons, and Thousand Suns just becomes a Tzeentch book and you can take Tzeentch Demons, etc. I don't think that there should be a Demons book and then also these god-specific chapters that take demons just this way. I think that they should just be one codex, but anyways. They show the Keeper of Secrets. The Keeper of Secrets just has a ton of sort of mid-strength attacks, so a lot of strength 6 and a few attacks at strength 8. So it's going to be pretty bad at killing vehicles. However, it is just going to murder like elite infantry. Like Terminators don't want to see this model. It has 10 attacks that just instantly will pop a Terminator. And yeah, it seems quite good. It's very sort of one-dimensional. Like it has one target it's good against, and it's going to kill that one. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And the Be'lakor is very clearly sort of the supreme commander character because he has this aura that you pick what it does. The first one, Wreath in Shadows, seems incredibly strong. You have an aura of 6 inches where you can only be targeted if you're within 18 on turn 1, because notably you pick in at the start of the battle round, not in the command phase. So you can just make your whole army untargetable effectively on turn 1 unless your opponent really sort of advances on you, which is absolutely great. Next we have Pall of Despair, which if your opponent's units are below starting strength and they're within 6 of this model, they have to take Battle Shock tests. And if they're like a one model unit, they count as being below starting strength. And then the Shadow Lord is you reroll Battle Shock tests and leadership tests within 6. So also, what I didn't mention is that the area within 6 inches of Be'lakor just counts as being in the Shadow of Chaos, so he basically has Warp Locust, because even if you don't control a lot of objectives in the mid-board, you can still deep strike within 6 of him, and then be outside of 6 inches of enemies and then charge them immediately. Which is pretty great. They show the Bioblade, just how extra hits work. It shows you can't modify them. They show Skarbrand, who has 8 gajillion attacks, either at damage 2 with 1 AP or at strength 16 with 6 damage. So he's actually going to be really good at killing vehicles, or just like hordes of Space Marines or whatever. Then their stratagem, Corrupt Real Space. Again, this is basically just like the exact same rule that the Imperial Guardsmen have. You sticky the objective, except the objective is also the Shadow of Chaos. Kind of wish they could have just come up with like some kind of special rule. So it's just this objective is secured. Like this, you have objective secured on this objective now, and cancel the Shadow of Chaos. This could just be shortened if you just make objective secured a keyword. All right, Sisters of Battle. Their army rule is Miracle Dice. You use Miracle Dice. You say in advance you're going to be like, I want my advance roll to be a 6, and it's a 6 because you generated Miracle Dice. I'm not going to go over this because this is, from my knowledge, literally exactly the same. And then their detachment rule, the Blood of Martyrs, which is +1 hit if you're below half strength, and +1 to wound if you're below half strength. So sorry, +1 hit below starting strength, +1 to wound if you're below half strength. I don't necessarily love this one, only because I think it's actually a very drastic change to how Sisters normally play. If you have played against Sisters in 9th edition, generally they're taking these small units and they're trading with you in the midboard. So what that means is, they usually have pretty strong, or historically at least, they've had pretty strong secondaries. They can kind of sit back behind cover. They can defend the shrine. They can raise banners or something and kind of just hang out. And then when you need to approach them to stop them from scoring, they send out these cheap units with a bunch of buffs on them, and then those units kill you. And then when you're trading, you're trading down because scissors units are very cheap, but they can hit hard if they have a lot of buffs on them. The issue with this is you won't benefit from this with that strategy because your units are going from being full health to just dying. And generally you don't care because they're like 100 points or less. But with this rule, you're going to be encouraged to take very large units, and then they're obviously going to trade less efficiently. So I don't really know how to feel about it. It could just be the army plays completely differently, which is totally fine by me. But sort of at a glance, it doesn't seem like it's going to do much if the current strategy for Sisters sort of continues in the next edition. The Triumph, it picks 2 buffs, which are always these sort of relics of the different sub-factions previously. They include things like you get better leadership. When you lose units within 6, you can make the miracle dice. The miracle die you get automatically 6. The Ebon Chalice one is, to me, kind of obviously the standout, where you have a unit that can just perform multiple acts of faith. So what you can do is you can move something like a Retributor unit in range of the Triumph, and then miracle die hit roll, miracle die wound roll, miracle die damage roll, and just make that unit, much more efficient than it was. And pop something like a transport, and then charge it with a different unit. You have options there. Sisters of Battle, very sort of standard battle line unit. The one thing is they generate a ton of miracle dice though, because if you hold an objective with them, you get a miracle dice. If they perform an act of faith once a battle with the cherub, you get a miracle dice. If they die, you get a miracle dice. So, depending on how cheap these are, you could field a ton of them. You could play with, very loosely with them. You can kind of have them, you put them on objective, they die. Oh no, you get a bunch of miracle dice, and then your actual hammer units hit way harder because they're using a bunch of acts of faith. They show the Exorcist, which has indirect fire. This gun actually seems pretty decent. It's D6 damage. Again, D6 shots plus 2, D6 damage, so fairly swingy. But being able to shoot something like a Rhino without even exposing yourself and having a reasonable chance of popping it, I think is quite good. They show Morvenn Vahl's weapon, which is either 5 attacks at strength 8, -2, 3, or 10 strength 5 attacks. This, I don't really remember her weapon right now. This seems like a bit of a nerf, but I'm not totally sure. And then the Rejoice the Fallen stratagem. Well, effectively, when your unit dies, you can shoot. So, pretty perfect for something like Retributors. You could also just use it on a tank. You can just use it on Exorcist. No reason not to, because it just says Sororitas unit. Next, we have the Leagues of Votann, and they changed Judgment tokens to be, if you have a Judgment token, +1 to hit. If you have 2 Judgment tokens, +1 to hit and +1 to wound. I really like this change, mostly because I think Judgment tokens were a pretty toxic army-wide rule, because effectively what ended up happening is you had an army-wide rule that was pretty easy to access, if you're just playing the game and they're doing things like holding objectives and holding actions, which again aren't much of like a strategic decision from your opponent. If they want to win, they have to hold objectives and do actions. It's not like they're going to not do those things so you don't get Judgment tokens. Like they basically have to win the game in the way that scoring works. In 9th edition, you want, it's like a race to 100 points. So if you're not doing these things, you're probably going to lose. And then as you do those actions, you get Judgment tokens. Then your toughness characteristic just doesn't matter, because the majority of your opponent's hits, let's say they're hitting on 3s, 3/4 of those hits, which are going to be on 4s or more on average, just automatically wound you. I didn't like it. I thought it was kind of a silly mechanic. This makes way more sense because +1 to hit is something that can be interacted with. -1 to hit matters. And then +1 to hit and +1 to wound. Again, +1 to wound. It helps to mitigate your opponent's good toughness values, but it doesn't just ignore it. It still helps to have, a high toughness value if the Votann player is shooting at you with a high strength weapon, because maybe instead of going from wounding on 3s to wounding on 2s, you're going from wounding on 4s to wounding on 3s. So overall, I think this is much better. Next, we have Ruthless Efficiency. I like this rule because it has a sort of a cat and mouse thing going on. So basically, you pick a unit from your opponent's army. This is the detachment rule, by the way. And that unit has 2 judgment tokens, and then depending on when you kill it, you get command points, with, you know, earlier in the game getting you more command points. So I like this because you could either pick your opponent's big bad unit, and you can be like, I want the judgment tokens on it right away, and I want to kill it. And then your opponent's going to be like, okay, well, I have this like really expensive unit, and I'm just going to play more conservatively with it now, and you're not going to kill it until, you know, turn 3 or turn 4 or turn 5. But as a Votann player, you might be happy because they're not using this expensive unit as aggressively as they would normally. Alternatively, you could do something like, okay, my opponent's army has this 1 unit of 5 incursors, and I know they're going to forward deploy on this, you know, objective on the flank, and they're going to try to like raise a banner early or something. You just pick that unit, you put judgment tokens on it. Now it's extremely trivial to kill, and if you kill it, you get a bunch of command points. And if your opponent wants to deny you those command points, they're not going to be using the actual utility of the unit. So I like this rule quite a bit. Next, we see the Hearthkin Warriors. Again, this rule, like it's thematically cool, just like the name, but it's just the Imperial Guard rule. Like, you sticky the objective. So I wish this could have just been a keyword. And the rest isn't really, I don't really see anything different as far as what the Hearthkin Warriors do. They're down to hitting on 4s, but you have +1 to hit, generally speaking. So bit of a nerf, but the utility of the unit is still there. The Land Fortress, it's big. It has toughness 12, 16 wounds. When units get out of it, they reroll their wound rolls. And what they have seen, I think what we learned from this is that beams, what were previously beams, just have sustained hits D3. So you're just sort of hitting more when you target something rather than sort of like measuring and putting your ruler through different units and all that kind of stuff. And we see that again on this other beam weapon with the conversion rule. So because this is it's a conversion beamer, which generally in 40k is meant the farther you are, it's actually better. And this is if you're outside of 12, hits of 4-up are critical hits. And then the stratagem. Your punch shooting phase. So when your opponent's unit that has a judgment token shoots, the unit that was targeted by that unit can shoot back. Pretty good, honestly. And now finally we get World Eaters. Their army-wide rule is Blessings of Khorne, and then they show how you generate these the Khorne dice. You get 8, you roll, and then you spend the you spend the dice on these bonuses. I've seen people be pretty negative towards this, mostly because, you know, it's random. You don't know if the Khorne player is going to roll 2 4s or higher or triples. You don't really know that. I would argue that it's fairly likely for like a lot of the first 3, and then the next 3 are less common, obviously. I will say I don't think it's bad that it's random. Just the inherent fact that it's random doesn't make it bad or doesn't make it like toxic or whatever. Especially because the bonuses that you will actually play around aren't random. Like, you can play around your opponent having +2 move because they're always going to have, like, the odds of not getting a double are extremely low. And +2 move is very powerful, so they're probably just going to use that one. And then something like sustained hits, or, you know, your opponent having a feel no pain, or your opponent having lethal hits. Maybe I'm maybe I'm not understanding something, but I don't really play around my opponent having lethal hits. I'm not like, oh, you know, I'm going to position my unit over here because they could have lethal hits. Like, that's not what I'm going to do. Obviously, you have to play around whether or not they can advance and charge, which is probably the biggest one, is that you don't know if they're going to get triples or double 6s, and then they could advance and charge, which completely changes the game. I think that's probably... This is kind of the most problematic one, because this is very powerful, and it changes how you would position.
and it's random, and you don't know if they're going to be able to do it. So I could see that being a problem. I almost wish this costed less, just because playing around it would be more. Do you know what I mean? Like, it would be more obvious that they're going to do it. Like, okay, they're obviously going to advance and charge because it's easy to do and it's really strong. So I'm going to play around that. Whereas now, if you play around it and they don't generate it, you're just going to feel like an idiot. So I don't know. I don't really know how I feel about this. They don't show the detachment rule. They just show the army rule, and then they show what Khorne Berserkers do. They do the same thing as before, where you move after they're shot at, and they can engage you, and they can kind of tie you up. And each time you make a Blessings of Khorne roll, if the bearer's unit is within range of objective marker, you can reroll one of the dice. Blessings. Is this the Blessings of Khorne roll? Da, 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 da. So I guess you can reroll one of these dice if you have a Khorne Berserker unit on objective, which again just increases the odds of them being able to do something like advance and charge. Angron comes back if you use 666s. So again, pretty random, but it's not. I don't think it's like egregious, but I don't necessarily love it. And it's funny because the old Khorne rule was like the opposite of this. It was extremely consistent. You know what's coming because you can just count the units that died and be like, all right, well, my opponent's going to bring Angron back, or my opponent's going to do X or Y. The problem with the old Blood Tithe, because people were like, oh, the old Blood Tithe is so perfect, why change it? It was not. The problem with the old Blood Tithe was that it encourages one type of army from the Khorne player. You just play MSU and you take as many little 8-bound and Berserker units as possible because that generates the most Blood Tithe. And that scores you the most victory points, and that lets you use the most Blood Tithe bonuses. Additionally, if your opponent is also playing an MSU army, the matchup becomes extremely annoying because it's hard to wipe a whole Khorne Berserker unit in one activation, so they're getting their Blood Surge. You're giving them a bunch of Blood Tithe points. And so I get from a decision-making standpoint, the old Blood Tithe wasn't toxic, but from just like a matchup perspective where you walk up to the table and you set up your army and you're like, oh shit, it's Khorne. I'm running MSU. They have MSU. They're going to basically score like 90 plus victory points, and there's nothing I can do about it. So the old system had its problems. I don't think this fixes the problems, really. It just makes it a little less consistent on the Khorne player, which I don't hate, but I don't necessarily love the way it's implemented. Their stratagem, it is, you basically hold the objective if you were destroyed off of it. I like this because what happens with Khorne, this synergizes well with Berserkers because you don't want to get near them when you shoot them. You just want to shoot them and kill the whole unit and not get near them so you don't get blood surged into you. But then the Khorne player uses Blood Offering, they hold the objective anyways. So it obviously synergizes with their rules. I think this is probably the best stratagem I've seen, just in terms of its utility. And that's it. We've gone through every army. It's been a pretty long little discussion here. And I put in order the first 9 here of the armies we've gone over. And I'm going to rank them in terms of how... I'm going to get rid of the F tier. I just don't think anything's that bad. We're going to rank them in terms of how interesting they are and how well or how good of a job I think they did of sort of presenting the army and how they're going to function in 10th. So first we were shown Space Marines. I think Oath of Moment is just a very powerful rule. The doctrines are very intuitive and they're powerful. Guilliman synergizes with the army-wide rule. So we're going to put Space Marines in A tier. Next we have Tyranids. My issue with Tyranids is they didn't show their detachment. And I don't really love half of their army rule, which is the whole battle shock, the whole enemy army thing. I actually basically like nothing about the Tyranid reveal, to be quite honest. So I'm going to put them in D tier. I was just not... as someone who plays Tyranids, nothing in that article made me excited about Tyranids in 10th, really. Chaos Space Marines, I think this is pretty clearly the most interesting one. You get a complete perspective of how they work. They show you characters that influence their rules. Their rules are thematic, and they also seem pretty powerful, so It's just obvious S tier for me. Necrons, I'm going to put Necrons in C. I'm only going to put them above Tyranids because they actually show their detachment rule. But the issue is they show you their detachment rule that depends on characters, and they don't show you any characters. So you don't know how applicable it's actually going to be in a game. Also, reanimation is just reworked in a way that is not as toxic as it was before. Again, reanimation was not good. I'm not trying to defend it as being this like OP rule, but it was very dependent on your opponent's army and whether or not they took individual units that can just like wipe a Necron unit. If they're playing MSU, they're not going to be able to do that, and it's going to be annoying. If they did, then your rule is irrelevant to the entire game, and it feels bad. So reanimation protocols always felt bad for one player. Now it does not. And so for that reason alone, I'm going to put them above Tyranids, but I still don't think it's like necessarily an amazing article. Imperial Guard, going to put them in B. Imperial Guard to me was just everything was as expected. They get orders. The orders aren't like crazy anymore. It seems like they won't explode. Guardsmen do what you think guardsmen would do. The tanks do what you think they would do. Next we have demons. For me, demons again, it's also an S tier. They show you the army-wide rule. It's thematic. They show you the detachment rule, which I think that was the detachment rule, which was the whole locust type deep strike. They show you characters that influence that, stratagems that, like everything works around this unified rule, which is the Shadow of Chaos. And that makes complete sense. Seems reasonably powerful. I'm going to put them in S tier. Next we have Sisters. Again, I'm going to put them in B just because they function exactly how you think they would. You generate miracle dice when you're dying. The sort of chaff units generate extra miracle dice. You spend the miracle dice on effects. It's nothing in this article surprised me. Nothing really disappointed me. It was exactly as I thought. Votann, I'm going to put them in A tier. Not because I think they got better. I think it's actually most of the stuff they've shown was like strictly a downgrade. However, it's just so much better for both players. Like judgment tokens, I did not like how they worked in the previous edition. I think +1 to hit, +1 to wound is a much more healthy mechanic. I like the cat and mouse game you get from their detachment rule where you're picking a unit. It's easier to kill. You're getting command points if you kill it. Your opponent has to sort of decide if it's worth it to still use that unit aggressively or not. And so I like that. I'm going to put Votann in A. Next one, World Eaters. I'm probably going to put World Eaters in C because I don't think we see the detachment rule again. And the Blessings of Khorne thing is just so strange to me. The stratagem I think was a good choice, and it looks very strong and makes thematic sense. But just because of not really liking their army rule and also not seeing their detachment rule, I'm going to put them in C tier. And that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed. This is a pretty long one. Yeah, take it easy.